I'm Sandra Smith.
I'm Brett Baer.
I'm Ainsley Earhart, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, April 24th, 2020. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. As several states begin opening up some parts of their economies, some wonder if it's too soon. Others point out over the past 5 weeks, 26 million people have become unemployed.
We have to think in terms of trade-offs. Reopening needs to happen eventually. It needs to happen slowly. It needs to happen in a smart way.
I'm Dave Anthony. He's the only black Republican ever elected to the House, then the Senate. And he's a big Trump supporter. So Tim Scott is sometimes shunned.
I have had the pain of rejection from the African-American community, and the easiest way to deal with that is to recognize that the journey that I'm on is less about me.
And I'm Tom Shalhoub. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Conservative economist Thomas Sowell once said, "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." And that may best describe the situation for many right now in dealing with the COVID-19 virus. Americans are watching closely as governors like Georgia's Brian Kemp begin reopening things with restrictions.
In the same way that we carefully closed businesses and urged operations to end to mitigate the virus spread, today we are announcing plans to incrementally and safely reopen sectors of our economy.
In Tennessee, it means most state parks are reopening today. In Texas, retailers can start offering curbside pickup. In Wisconsin, golf courses are reopening with some restrictions. Oklahoma's allowing barbershops and salons to open with restrictions, and Georgia is allowing those kinds of shops to open as well, along with tattoo parlors and gyms. Vice President Mike Pence said they're encouraging elective surgeries to resume if they can. And Pence says 16 states have now announced formal reopening plans.
And we're encouraged to see so many states embracing the phased approach to reopening their economies that's contemplated in our guidelines for opening up America again. For instance, Governor Mike Parson of Missouri announced the Show Me Strong Recovery Plan has 2 initial phases intended to protect the most at risk.
One Democratic strategist tweeted that in Georgia's case, the governor was allowing human sacrifices to begin today, but even some scientists are talking about a need for balance.
It's a little soon to let off the social distancing, but at the same time, what everyone is going to have to understand is that things are going to have to reopen sooner or later.
Andrew Noymer is an associate professor of public health and an epidemiologist at the University of California, Irvine.
You know, from a purely epidemiological standpoint, we could keep the country closed for 15 months or more, and that would benefit in terms of reducing mortality and reducing infections. But it's just not going to happen in the real world. It just will not happen. And so we have to think in terms of trade-offs. And reopening needs to happen eventually. It needs to happen slowly. It needs to happen in a smart way. We don't just throw the doors wide open as quickly as they were slammed shut.
Now, is a place like Georgia going too far in your mind right now, reopening gyms, salons, tattoo parlors, or if you're going to start, just rip the Band-Aid off kind of in a place maybe like Georgia?
Well, I don't think we should rip the Band-Aid off. That's the whole point. I mean, ripping the Band-Aid off is not what's called for. I mean, we want to do this slowly. I would say gyms reopening, again, assuming we're talking about for customers to go, work out. That would be one of the last places that should reopen.
Right.
Not one of the first. So.
Well, Professor, I want to ask you because I read something interesting. I read, these shutdowns were never going to stop or kill the virus entirely, right? And you've referenced that. They were to buy us time so our healthcare system didn't get overrun. And that has happened to a certain extent, depending on who you ask, right? We've ramped up PPEs, bed space, ventilators, and we are more prepared again, depending on who you ask. So is it time to start letting some people, go out and about and work while maybe telling older or vulnerable people, hey, you don't need to be a part of this early reopening? Would that sort of be, I guess, a mixed bag way to go to initially start this?
Definitely. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that, people are going to start opening up black market businesses, if they're prevented from reopening their regular businesses forever. So, nobody wants that. So testing still needs to come up. In certain places. I mean, there are lots of differences from place to place in how available testing is.
Yeah.
But some businesses are going to have to bit by bit reopen, and you make a perfect example of older people who may be more vulnerable, or someone who doesn't have anything with which to cover their mouth and nose, may not wish to go out. People are going to have to start judging their own risk and the risk that their household faces, because as the government starts lifting, and hopefully slowly and bit by bit, but as they start lifting these lockdowns, people are going to have to be their own first line of defense for their own selves and for their own households.
How key, though, is testing, right? Because you look at a country like South Korea, they flattened their curve quickly. They were doing mass testing really early on. And then you hear, you and I are both in California, you hear our governor, Newsom, say before he opens anything or allows anything to be reopened, he wants 60,000 people a day at minimum tested. And what, in your mind, when you look at like a South Korea and you hear the governor of California, how important is mass testing at this point?
Mass testing is actually really important. And it's kind of complicated because I think some people have kind of fetishized testing. They're like, oh, testing, and all they want to talk about is testing. And it's important to remember that testing doesn't treat or cure any disease. But testing gives you information. So testing actually can prevent further cases, because if you found out, oh my gosh, this dry cough I have is actually COVID, I'm going to, stay home from work for the next 2 weeks, versus having no information and just thinking, well, this is just a dry cough and I'm going to go to work. So testing is important. Testing gives us information. Testing is not everything. And we should stop crying over spilt milk about the fact that we didn't have testing early on the way South Korea did. I mean, it would have been better, and there certainly is going to have to be a calling to account and an investigation into why we were so slow to get testing to where it needed to be, and we need more transparency in all of this. But from the public health standpoint going forward, we're not going to nip this thing in the bud the way the South Koreans did with testing early, because we're no longer early.
But talk to me more about South Korea for a second, because I want your thoughts on why they were able to flatten their curve so early. Aside from having mass testing, I'm reading all kinds of things, like, for example, how they had to deal with MERS in 2015.
Yeah, South Korea has lots of experience with coronavirus. They actually got kind of caught unawares by MERS a little bit. They had a returning traveler from the Middle East who had the disease, and there was actually some hospital transmission, that is to say inside the hospital. And so they got a lot of experience with that. They learned from their mistakes. Mistakes were made with MERS in the early days in 2014 in South Korea, but they learned very well from those mistakes about isolation, the importance of, making sure a patient who has a new respiratory pathogen is treated in a room all by him or herself. So, the South Koreans have experience with these coronaviruses. They had stockpiles of PPE. They had testing. They really were poised to handle it well.
On the flip side of South Korea, you've got a country like Sweden. They didn't really lock down much of anything, right? And they have, just as we are talking right now, over about 16,000 cases and over 2,000 deaths. That is far more than their neighbors, by the way, of Norway, Denmark, and Finland. But of course, it's far fewer than other places. Maybe if we compared to Italy or New York. What do you make of a decision like Sweden's?
Sweden has been kind of defiant. They didn't lock down at all, practically. They did encourage social distancing, but they kept things open. And I mean, it's a perfect example of the trade-offs that get made, and the trade-offs that will have to be made as we begin to reopen the American economy. Sweden has more deaths than any of its Scandinavian neighbors, and a higher death rate, so even adjusting for population size. So, I mean, Sweden is not an unqualified success story. I mean, the Swedes have enjoyed more freedoms and no lockdown, but they've also paid the price in deaths. So you cannot unambiguously say, well, Sweden did the right thing, and look, the Swedes have been so free all this time. I mean, more Swedes have died than their neighbors. So it's not a slam dunk.
Did South Korea do the trade-off situation maybe the best of any country? I mean, they did shut down schools, but they did not shut down businesses, even when all of this was happening. They did intense temperature checks of people, right, walking into buildings. They had apps. I mean, right, people were signing up for apps to let them know when they came into contact with somebody who may have been infected. I don't know if Americans would go for that. But when you look at a country that maybe did the balancing act of the trade-offs early on, is it South Korea?
I think South Korea gets the A+. South Korea probably has the best response. I mean, mainland China, has a very authoritarian government, and so they can do things in terms of absolute lockdown and delivering food, to each household and whatnot that Wuhan did. But that's not going to work almost anywhere else apart from mainland China. So I think South Korea, in terms of outside China, gets the best grade. I mean, South Korea handled it extremely well. But I mean, they did have a weak first quarter economically as a result of the changes. So
sure.
They're not immune from the economic effects, and also they're not out of the woods in terms of we've seen some uptick in cases in Singapore and Japan. Some other Asian countries that did quite well in the first round and are now seeing second waves, or you can call it a prolonged first wave, you can call it whatever you like. But the point is, until we have a vaccine, no country is truly out of the woods.
And finally, when we talk about trade-offs, right, and balancing acts here, what about travel? How should the federal government handle travel to and from other countries, allowing travel in from other countries that maybe didn't take the kind of steps we did, if we really don't want a second wave?
There's so much coronavirus in the United States right now that worrying too much about travel restrictions is not the best use of our energy. I mean, people can go to a beach today in Florida and mingle with hundreds of other people if they so choose, because at least in some areas, the beaches are reopened. So if we're so worried about preventing every infection, we could prevent lots of them just by closing the beaches again. But that's a decision that people have made in Florida, that the beaches are going to stay open. So I don't think a few people coming in on a flight is really our number one concern.
Professor Andrew Noymer, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on your show.
This is Tom Shalhoub with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
When the House came back Thursday to vote on that nearly $500 billion package for hospitals, coronavirus testing, and to replenish the empty fund for small business loans, lawmakers did it in person. There was no proxy voting like House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had considered. She instead wants that issue studied.
To give members as many options as possible, and to do so in a way that, again, is respectful of this being the coronavirus, and not just for how we do business generally, but in this specific time, as also a template for any other kind of emergency that might arise.
But Republicans are wary.
Other people are able to get their jobs done with appropriate changes and appropriate precautions.
Congressman Tom Cole.
I do think we are capable of working the House of Representatives, and I will be extraordinarily cautious about giving up procedures and precedents that are 230 plus years old.
Remote voting is also something being considered in the Senate.
I think under emergency situations, we should be able to vote remotely.
Senator Tim Scott is a Republican from South Carolina.
If the business of the country needs to be done, I think we should be able to do it from a place outside of the Capitol from an emergency standpoint. In other words, in the midst of a pandemic where you can't travel, you should be able to vote. And if you can travel, you should come back to Washington and vote in the Capitol. But there are circumstances that we would never have thought of before the pandemic, where having the ability to remote vote based on the circumstances on the ground is so important. And I support that concept. I'm not sure that everybody does. We're not doing it, but it is in fact a positive more than it is a negative.
There are some who think there are constitutional issues with the idea of not being there in person to vote.
Can you imagine us not funding our Department of Defense because we can't get back to Washington because of a crisis that stops us from being able to travel there? I can't imagine us not being able to fund the $11 billion in the CARES Act or even approve it because we're not able to come back to Washington. $11 billion for vaccines and treatments, $45 billion for FEMA. Those resources require votes. And if we can't have agreement, we should have a mechanism to take care of that. But I welcome the conversation around the constitutionality of voting remotely, and frankly, look forward to understanding a different position than the one that I hold.
Senator Tim Scott is now an author with a book that came out this month, Opportunity Knocks: How Hard Work, Community, and Business Can Improve Lives and End Poverty. A story that takes him from starting out poor in South Carolina to ending up in Washington.
Being a freshman in high school, flunking world geography and civics to study of politics. My goodness, it tells me God has a sense of humor. that I became a United States Senator. I will say, failing Spanish and English as a freshman as well. My joke is, when you fail 2 languages, no one considers you bilingual, but they will call you biignorant because you can't speak in any language. Yeah, just going through those lessons and hardships reminds me that this truly is the most amazing country on earth, where a guy who's raised in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, not doing well in school, everything seems to be going against you. And then through the prayers of a mother, the help of a mentor, all of that turns around, and those messes that I created become a part of my message. That's a blessing. And that is only possible in a nation as good as ours.
I want to fast forward. You continued, you grew and you built businesses and you got into politics. You were successful on the state level. You ran for Congress and won. Then you get a call from Governor Nikki Haley, and she offers you the chance to be a United States Senator, which you've taken. And obviously, it's historic. You are the only African American to be a Republican in the House and then in the Senate. Were you aware of that when you took the job?
I was definitely not. And I think Nikki Haley, the governor at the time, afforded me an opportunity that it was just shocking. She says, "Would you like to be a senator?" And I said to myself, "Let me pray about it." Of course, I didn't say that. I said, yes. We were off and running. And the next morning, 11 a.m., we did a press conference, and more cameras than I've ever seen in one place, with my delegation standing with me, which was a blessing.
You started your book about how you were on your way to the White House, and you were about to have a meeting with President Trump, and you were nervous because you were critical of the president and how he had handled the Charlottesville mess and the clash between white supremacists and people in Charlottesville. Take us to that, and why did you start your book there?
In the aftermath of the Charlottesville controversy, I was fairly critical of the president's approach to good people being on both sides. I found his comments to be somewhat insensitive. And interestingly enough, the White House calls me on a Friday evening and says the president would like to sit down and talk with you about your public comments. And as you can imagine, having the president against you as a Republican in South Carolina that states ruby red is not a good idea. So
when you spoke out, you had people in your state who weren't happy with you, right?
No question. They were unhappy with me when I started speaking out. Not everyone, but a very loud vocal chorus. But I thought it was the right thing to do. And the president was what he has been with me the entire relationship that we've shared, is he was very kind. We spoke for over an hour. I didn't change his mind. He didn't change my mind. But he says at the end of our time together, he says the most remarkable thing. He says, "Help me help those I may have offended." For the president of the United States, the leader of the free world, to show deference to just a senator, for him to extend an olive branch unnecessarily doing so, told me so much about his character that I am today a fan, probably one of his largest, loudest supporters, because I know the heart of the man. Too many people don't understand the president of the United States, particularly people coming from communities of color. The president is he's a quintessential counterpuncher. If you hit him, he is going to hit you back.
His critics have called him a racist so many times. Not just a racist, his critics have called him a white supremacist.
Yeah, dead wrong and offensive.
And to further illustrate that, Senator Scott says his mother will never forget what happened on her 75th birthday.
I sent a note to the chief of staff saying I would love for the president just to jot a little note and send her a little note if he can. And I didn't know whether he would do it or not, but President Trump on her birthday calls us on the way to her party to spend 10 minutes talking to a wonderful single mom who was stunned into silence.
This is Donald Trump, right? This is Donald Trump you're talking about.
Yes. This is what the president does. It's remarkable.
So many people do not believe that exists.
It happens every time. That's the funny thing. I have been in the room with, 50 African-American leaders and the president. Everybody's laughing. They're talking about things. They're not always on the same page, by the way, but the camaraderie and the instant bond that you feel with them, it's palpable. And for those naysayers who take great pleasure in denigrating the president's character, listen, when he's wrong, call him out. But when he's right, give him the same blessing of your support as you don't give him when you disagree with him. He's helping disproportionately communities of color. When he puts as the top priority keeping communities safe and then making sure that people are sentenced justly, he's helping minority communities. When he sat down and asked that question and allowed his support of the opportunity zones to be public within 24 hours of that conversation, he brought back $67 billion to the poorest communities, not government money, private sector money, to combat the issue of poverty.
The senator working with the president earned him a standing ovation during the State of the Union address back in February.
Jobs and investments are pouring into 9,000 previously neglected neighborhoods thanks to Opportunity Zones, a plan spearheaded by Senator Tim Scott as part of our great Republican tax cuts.
So where are these zones and how do they work?
So opportunity zones are an opportunity for people to defer their capital gains tax that they would currently owe. In order to get that deferral, you have to make a long-term investment in one of the distressed communities around the country. There are over 8,700 designated opportunity zones. And by doing so, you defer your capital gains tax, but at the same time, whatever you're investing in is the new investment. If you keep it there for 10 years, you have no capital gains tax. What this has done is provided an opportunity for people and for places to receive a second look so they have a first and a new chance for prosperity.
You, as again an African American who's a Republican, do you find sometimes you're dismissed by many others in your community because you're not Democrat? And how do you deal with that when you are?
Yes, I have had the pain of rejection from the African American community, and the easiest way to deal with that is to recognize that the journey that I'm on is less about me and more about providing assistance to people who are in the same position I found myself as a young kid growing up in a single-parent household mired in poverty.
One final story. In 2008, before he was in Congress, Tim Scott, a Republican, helped his grandfather, who can't read but was determined to make history, go to the polls and vote for a Democrat. the first black president, Barack Obama.
I took his hand, we pushed a button together, and I will say without any question, it was one of the most powerful experiences in his lifetime to know that his country had changed during his lifetime where he could vote for an African American for president. And it says so much, as my grandfather taught me. He said, Timmy, this day should never have happened, because the South Carolina that I grew up in, he said, in the 1920s would never allow this to happen.
And you're descendants of slaves.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. And we started in Orangeburg County in South Carolina. And because of the transformation of the heart of the American people, the Southern heart in particular, I'm able to represent the state that at one point my grandfather couldn't even finish school in.
Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina, again, congratulations on your book. Thank you so much for joining us.
God bless. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network, download and listen to The Untold Story with Martha McCallum. The host of The Story on Fox News Channel sits down with major newsmakers each week to get their untold story. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
An Australian boy who has been bullied because of his name has gotten a special gift. Corona DeVries, who is 8, lives in Australia. When actor Tom Hanks and his wife, actress and singer Rita Wilson, tested positive for COVID-19 while they were in Australia, Corona DeVries sent them a letter.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hank, my name is Corona. I heard on the news you and your wife have caught the coronavirus. Are you okay?
The story of the boy's letter aired on local TV, and that's when he said he'd been getting bullied because of his name, with schoolmates calling him coronavirus. So Tom Hanks sent him a present, the retro Corona typewriter he happened to have brought to Australia with him. And he wrote back saying, quote, "Your letter made my wife and I feel so wonderful. You're the only person I've ever known to have the name Corona, like the ring around the sun, a crown." Hanks wrote, "I thought this typewriter would suit you. Ask a grown-up how it works and use it to write me back." Then he added a P.S. saying, "You've got a friend in me," a reference to Hank's character Woody in Toy Story. Corona says he feels like he's famous, and he's learning to use the typewriter. And as for that letter he owes the actor,
and I'm going to write back soon.
Looks like Tom Hanks has a friend in him. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Tom Shalhoub.
What's on your mind?
I'm recording today from my yard, or as my dad used to call it, the yard. It's a nice day. Get out to the yard. Got my audio rig outside here. You know, we're all spending a lot of time at home, and one of the strangest things that's happened during this coronavirus crisis that we're in is that the approach to almost everything has become split along the left-right, red state, blue state divide. And it seems the latest heated argument is when is too soon to end the shutdown. Now, most regular folks, I think, are itching to get back to work. I certainly am. And I think we're going to be able to handle it just fine. Now, why do I think this? It's not based on my political ideology. And it's not because of something I read in the newspaper or somebody I watched on cable news. It's because I've been out several times. And I'm assuming you have too. Most of us, if we're not essential workers, are making quick runs out of our home. I've been to the grocery store twice. I've been to a home improvement store once, a taco shop, twice to a pizza place, and last night I made a beer run on my bike to a local bar that's selling six-packs to go. In every instance, the merchants have dealt with the health recommendations in their own way. The employees wear masks and gloves, and there's ample hand sanitizer available. They're observing proper distance. The stores have 6-foot spacing in the lines at the registers inside the stores, or they're only allowing a certain number of customers inside the store at a time. The smaller establishments have curbside service. They pay by phone or credit card. There's no contact, there's no touching. It's all very tidy. These store employees are behaving like medical personnel in a hospital. responsibly. As far as my workplace goes, today I am working from home, but I've been into the Fox News building several times to tape TV shows, and all the employees observe very strict procedures. I've felt perfectly safe at all times. When I go out for my daily run or a bike ride, my neighbors that are on the outside are all behaving responsibly as well. Seems that most people know how to do what they have to do to be safe. The narrative that's playing out on TV and on social media seems to be, do you want to be risky and go back to work, or do you want to be safe and stay inside? Most people, I think, are sensible. Most people realize we can do both.
I'm Tom Shalhoub.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust, and click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.